Good morning. Open your Bibles, if you would, to Mark chapter 3. That's where we'll get started. It's talking with folks in Roaring Springs, how interesting it is, the way this is set up. Oh, I like that. Echo, echo. Hey, hit the Darth Vader button. That's the one I like. Hit the Darth Vader button.
My father is in the back of the room.
Okay. Anyway, it's always sort of fun when you plan a series. You know, there's lesson 1 and 2, and it's sequential. But because of the nature of the relationship between Matador and Roaring Springs, it's sort of fun because you do lesson 2, and then lesson 1, and then lesson 2 again, and then it kind of straightens out after that. So that's been sort of fun. This series in 1 John, I hope you're encouraged by as we look at how we walk in faith, that we can live lives of faith, lives in confidence and assurance in our relationship with God. I don't know how you feel, but it's happened again recently, but with news and what's going on, it's easy for me to feel overwhelmed or concerned or frustrated or like, everything is so terrible, what are we going to do? And there's kind of this, I don't know, latent concept, I guess, is maybe we could just kind of hide behind the door, lock the door, and just sort of wait this thing out. Maybe it'll go away someday. When Christ calls us to make a difference. This letter has been written toward the close of the first century. John is the last living apostle. This is written somewhere toward the end of the first century, somewhere around between 80 maybe and 90, somewhere in that. And John is, round numbers, is potentially somewhere between 70 and 80 years old, at a time when the average lifespan was about 50. Which means he's one of the oldest people that people in the church have ever seen. In fact, history says that he has gotten so old that he's so feeble, he's no longer mobile. He can't walk very well, and so he's carried in by his fellow Christians. Not only can he not walk, he doesn't have the trunk strength to even sit by himself, and so he's typically propped up against a wall or something so that he can sit up. And the church gathers around him, this really, really old man who's 30 years older than the average old person. And they would ask him, John, do you have a word from the Lord for us? And then notice, if you would, let's see, I had you go to Mark 3. I tell you what, let's go to 1 John, then we'll go backwards just because that's how my mind works. 1 John chapter 1. 1 John chapter 1. And I want you to look at the language and try to put the words to a face or to a tone of voice. In chapter 2, verse 1 is what I was thinking of. When he starts this chapter, he's going to talk about sin, right? He's going to tell them that they shouldn't be sinning. Now, I don't know about you, but this is where he could say, don't sin, or turn and burn, or, something like that. Something, with some pizzazz. He says, my little children, I write these things to you so that you may not sin. And if anyone sins, he has an advocate with the Father. Try to put the tone, this is the interpretation part, try to put the tone of voice and the facial expression with those words. I'm guessing he's probably not scowling at them or angry with them, but there's this love. The way he talks to them. In fact, if you go over it a little bit later in verse 7, he says, Beloved, I'm not writing a new commandment to you, but an old commandment. He calls them children. He calls them beloved. He'll talk about, I'm writing to you fathers, I'm writing to you young men, I'm writing to you children. And so he has this spiritually grandfatherly approach as he communicates these truths. Well, what I'm excited about is that's not who John was in the beginning. So let's go to Mark chapter 3, and let's look at what Jesus had to work with. Mark chapter 3 is the first place where we're going to get a flavor of John. Let's see. I don't want to start there, or Luke 9. I tell you what, Mark chapter 9, it will be where we'll start, verse 33. Here's a picture of John. He's probably the youngest apostle. So he's going to be a young guy, and some young men are really gentle and mature, and the rest of them probably aren't, right? Just in general. All right, he's one of the younger apostles. Chapter 9, verse 33. They come to Capernaum, and while Jesus is in the house, he began to question them. What were you discussing on the way? But they kept silent. Nobody wants to say anything. Why is that? Well, they don't want to admit what they were talking about. What were they talking about? Well, they kept silent, for on the way they had discussed with one another which one of them was the greatest. Isn't that wonderful? This is chapter 9, okay? So they have known Jesus for a little bit. How many miracles would you have to see? How many Bible lessons from Jesus would you have to hear before you stopped arguing about which one of you was the greatest when you were around him? Okay? That'd be like being around a couple of NBA players and bragging about your jump shot. Or just being around somebody that, wow, they're amazing, but, you know, we're pretty amazing now that I think about it. What are they arguing about? They're discussing which one of them is the greatest. The word discussion means it's been an ongoing conversation. They've compared and contrasted, pointed things out. It's been quite a conversation. And when Jesus says, so what y'all nothing. Because they already know it's a foolish, even a ridiculous conversation. Now then, in verse, let's see, here's where we want to skip. All right, let's go to Luke chapter 9. This is my favorite story about John. Luke chapter 9. While you're turning there, I'm going to read for you the passage in Mark chapter 3 that we're going to start with. Because in verse 17 is where, this is Mark 3:17. You just stay in Luke. We'll get you there. He's naming the disciples that Jesus has chosen. And we read in verse 17, and James the son of Zebedee, and John the brother of James, to whom he gave the name Boanerges, which means sons of thunder. Now, if you nickname somebody a son of thunder, what does that mean? That's a polite way of saying loudmouth, right? That's what that means. So John was given a nickname with his brother, both of them now, sons of thunder. Really outgoing personality, but not just that, just really out there and loud and proud, all right? Which, unless that's really pulled back, that's going to mean the loudmouth. Now, we also have the fact that all the disciples are discussing among themselves which ones are the greatest. Here's a great snapshot of John as the son of thunder in Luke chapter 9. In verse 46, now this is after they were already caught discussing which one of them is the greatest. This is a constant problem among the disciples. Luke 9, verse 46, an argument started among them as to which one of them might be the greatest. See, earlier they discussed it. Now they're arguing about it because they're sure, they're confident about how great they are. So here's an argument about this. But Jesus, knowing what they were thinking in their heart, took a child, stood him by his side and said, whoever receives this child in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives him who sent me. For the one who is least among you all, this is the one who is great. So they've been caught in an argument. Jesus tells them the truth and gives them an example. John, what does John gain from what just was said? What did he learn? Not much. Verse 49. John answered. Now, some translations handle this a little differently because the word is odd. Answered, nobody asked him a question. But that's the word because, see how to illustrate this. Have you ever been in a conversation, maybe when you were younger, and people were talking about important things, and you wanted to be a part of that conversation? I mean, you didn't really belong, but you wanted to contribute to that conversation, so you finally answer a question that nobody's asked you? That's what's happening. He answers, nobody asked him a question. Yeah, but he wants to get in the middle of this. He answered and said, Master, we saw someone calling out demons in your name, and we tried to prevent him because he does not follow along with us. Jesus said, do not hinder him, for he who is not against you is for you. Now keep your finger there, and let's compare that to a passage in Matthew chapter 12. What we're doing here is we're doing a background study of John. We're trying to learn something about John as a young disciple and apostle. Matthew chapter 12, verse 30. We're going to need to keep these two passages. We're going to flip back and forth for a second here between these two. Matthew 12, verse 30, Jesus said, he who is not with me is against me. He who does not scatter with me, he who does not gather with me scatters. All right, let's just take the first half. He who is not with me is against me. Right? Got it? Flip over to Luke chapter 9, verse 50. And we read, he who is not against you is for you. Well, that's interesting. Matthew, if he's not with me, he's against me. Luke, if they're not against you, they're for you. Well, when we consider the larger context, there's something that stands out I should have noticed the first time, and it's the pronouns. In Matthew, Jesus says, he who is not with me. Okay? In Luke, he says, if they're not against you. Jesus and the apostles are not the same. What John said is, let's go back now to Luke chapter 9. John said, verse 49, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we tried to prevent him because he does not follow along with us. That's different than he's not following with you. There's an assumption. If you don't think the way I do, then there's something wrong with you. Can you hear the difference? There's a difference in focusing on Christ and focusing on ourselves. That's why they were arguing about which one of them is the greatest. Who are you focused on to have that argument? Because if you look right at Jesus, that argument evaporates. Because he is so holy, he is so superior, that the difference in us is inconsequential because he is holy and we are not. And that's it. But if we take our eyes off Jesus, now we can compare our holiness. I'm a little more holy than you. I'm a little less holier than you. I'm a little better than you. I'm a little worse than you. I can have that argument if I'm not looking at Jesus. So, he says, they are not following after us. Jesus says, do not hinder him, for he is not against you, is for you. Has John learned anything? Let's keep reading. Son of thunder, here we come. Verse 51. When the days were approaching for his ascension, he was determined to go to Jerusalem. And he sent messengers on ahead of him, and they went and entered a village of the Samaritans to make arrangements for him. But they did not receive him because he was traveling toward Jerusalem. When his disciples, James and John, saw this, they said, Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them? Say, what? I love this. This is one of my favorite snapshots of John. You talk about a young son of thunder when he says, well, Lord, they didn't accept you. We'll handle this. We'll just back up, Lord. We got this. We'll just call down fire from heaven and we'll burn them all up. That's what we'll do. Can you see Jesus going, what? Okay, first of all, you're going to call down fire from heaven, are you? All right, big boy, make it happen. Let's see some smoke. Let's see what you got, because what they got is nothing without Jesus. Now, that's true. See, what's happened is, already earlier, Jesus has given them the authority to cast out demons and heal the sick. Jesus has given them the authority. Jesus gave them the authority. They don't have it. They never had it. They're never going to have it. The power is God, not them. But when you get on to the us and not to the him, guess what you start thinking? We got this. Look at us. We got this. So first of all, you can see Jesus going, really? You're going to call down fire from heaven? Number two, that's not what we're here to do. If we're here to fry people and not save people, you're going to get fried too, buddy. Because if this is about calling down fire on sinners, guess what? It's going to get warm. Okay? This is a great picture of John. Should we just call down fire on them? My little children, I write these things to you that you may not sin. And if you sin, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous. What happened? That's not the same guy. No, it's not. Because walking in faith, this faith walking is about a destination. It's a journey. It's starting where you are and being led somewhere else. I love the expression that God accepts us just the way we are, but he absolutely refuses to leave us that way. It's no good to say, well, that's just how I am. That's not it. Because unless you're like Jesus, because that'd be okay. But if you're not like Jesus, then how you are is not enough. And what God is doing and calling us to is change, is growth. All of us in some way are sons and daughters of thunder. All of us have acted and said and had attitudes and behaviors that's not what God's about. And so what God is about is bringing change. I love the picture of John as this spiritual grandfather. One of the things that I find fascinating is how life grows you and changes you. Years ago, when Byron was probably about 3, he was pretty spry and mobile as a little guy. We were sitting at the house there across the way and for one of the holidays, and Dad's in his recliner, and he's got the footrest up, and he's kicked back, and Byron crawls up in Granddad's lap and kind of messes around, and he crawls out on the footrest, and then he stands up. And he bounces off of it like a high dive and goes flying over and then lands on the floor, thinking it's great fun. Well, it nearly throws Granddad out of the chair, and you can see it tweak the chair and all that sort of stuff. And furniture's not a jungle gym and all those things that you teach your kids, right? And so I told Byron, I said, don't do that again. Don't be jumping off that chair. Well, you know what happens next? Time passes, and Byron kind of eases back over to the chair, and he's doing his thing. He gets up in Granddad's lap, and I'm watching him. I see what he's doing. I'm not blind, right? Children are like, man, how did my parents know that? Because children are that dumb, really. I mean, that's just the truth. So he gets up in there, and then he sure enough, you know what he's doing? He's easing out, and he's standing up in the chair next to Granddad, and he's about to step out on the footrest again. I'm watching him, and I've already told him. So, whatever he does next is his choice, and then when he makes a choice, he receives the benefit of that choice, right? So he's just almost at the point of no return, and my dad leans forward, wraps up Byron, and pulls him back. He interferes with my parenting. You imagine that? And I said, Dad, you need to leave him alone. He needs to decide. And you know what my dad says? Now, you don't know this, okay? But when I was raised up, okay, I know the sound a belt tip makes as it pops out of the belt loops in a quick draw. I mean, you couldn't see the belt, it was so fast, but you could hear it, okay? My dad never said, this is going to hurt me more than it hurt you. I don't think he ever said it because I know it never was true for sure, okay? His particular technique was to hold me by the hand and introduce a little motivation to my life. And I used to try to run around in a circle like a maypole, run around, because I thought if I could run fast enough, I could reduce the closure speed of the belt. I never got that fast. I tried. One particular occasion, I remember, I put on 4 extra pair of underwear and 2 pair of jeans, and he compensated. That's how I grew up. I'd hear, son, that's it. I'd be told something one time, and that'd be the end of it. So that's how I grew up. That was what I was taught, and that's why I was trying to raise my kids the same way. And now, all of a sudden, he's interfering with the discipline process. So I said, Dad, you got to let him make his choice. And you know what my dad says? He says, same guy, I guess, same guy. He says, I just can't stand to see him cry. Since like when? Because, I did a whole lot of that. That didn't change nothing in my experience. Well, over the years, Dad has told me things as a grandfather that he's thought about since he was a father, about how make sure you spend time with your kids. Don't get wrapped up in just what you're doing. The kid wants to help out, and if a kid helps out, he's going to make it worse, and it's going to take twice as long. But the relationship is more important than the project, and those sorts of things that a grandfather learns that a young father is still trying to figure out. I used to say that apparently when you become a grandparent, you tip your head and all your brains pour out, because it's like, what happened? Well, it's really not that. It's growing. It's life experience. It's understanding what's important in a bigger picture. When you're a young parent, you're just trying to get through today and get some rest maybe somewhere. That's a great picture of how God grows us or draws us along. And John is going to be used by God to say and to teach and to immolate and to express some beautiful things about what it means to walk in faith. And so as he starts out as a young man, here's this heat, here's this drive. We're gonna call down fire from heaven. But the tone changes. Not just because he's older. Because age is not a guarantee of growth. I like an expression. You can gain 20 years of experience, or you can repeat 1 year's worth of experience 20 times. There's a difference in whether or not we will learn from the things that we experience and the things that God teaches us. Let's go back to 1 John now, chapter 1. At the close, the first century is beginning to wind down. Rome is beginning to crumble. They were the world superpower. They had tremendous prestige and had an elite experience. It was quite something to be a Roman citizen in the first century. In fact, earlier in the book of Acts, you watch how the Apostle Paul, on a couple of occasions, has some real advantages to being a Roman citizen. It really means something. But as the first century is beginning to wind down, things are starting to come apart for the Roman culture. Those within power of Rome began to conclude that it was a spiritual problem. Now, the Romans had borrowed or taken or adapted the Greek mythology with the pantheon of Greek gods. That's why a lot of those gods have a Greek and a Latin name. The Romans just took that same structure and gave it their own names and went on with it. As things start to come apart, those in power began to be concerned that this was a spiritual issue. They were right. It just went the wrong way. So they said that what's wrong is the gods are not happy with us, that we're not being faithful and loyal, so we're going to have to take out any competition. And so the persecution of the church, of Christians, those who follow Christ, begins from that theological background, that Christians are the problem. And they didn't really distinguish between Christians and Jews. Just those who weren't following the Roman faith began to be persecuted because they're the problem. So when John writes this letter, that's already on the horizon. The clouds are gathering. Things are not going good. It's not popular to be a Christian. It's not cool to be a Christian. It's not advantageous to be a Christian already. Now, they've already endured Jewish persecution. We saw that in the book of Acts. That every time that Paul would go and teach and people would accept Christ, they'd follow him as the Messiah, the Jews in the area would jump on him. So they've already experienced that. But what's coming is of such greater intensity because of the tremendous authority of the Roman government. By the time this little letter is written, there's already, as I've said, loss of favor and loss of standing. There's also loss of property. And loss of life is coming soon. And so I find it beautiful that what John's going to write is 5 chapters, and then of course 2nd and 3rd John is little chapters, but he's going to give us these 5 chapters in that atmosphere or environment. So I don't know how you feel about where our society is and how things are going. That's one of the reasons why I love this book. Because it's written to people who are as concerned and have more reason to be concerned than you and I do. One of the things that I love, John says, we're going to look in chapter 1, verse 5. He says, "This is the message that we have heard from him and announced to you." Did you get that? He sort of stops and says, okay, this is it. This is what you need to know. This is the message, and this is what we're going to announce. What is that, John? He says in verse 5, that God is light, and in him there's no darkness at all. And you say, okay, not what I was expecting. Because the way John signposts that, here's something you need to know. This is it right here. What is it? God is light. Okay,
what do I do with that? Now, that's one of John's favorite expressions he used in the fourth gospel about God as light and the contrast between light and darkness. One of the things I think I'm most frustrated about today is the inability to get good information. Whatever there's some issue going on and you wonder what happened and you start trying to listen to the news or you try to read about it, it doesn't take very long to realize that we're often not given facts. We're given a spin or a slant or an agenda. And sometimes I want to just yell, can you just tell me what happened and I'll decide what it means? Whether we're talking about violence, whether we're talking about global warming, whether we're talking about decisions made at a national, can you just tell me the facts and then I'll sort out what I think ought to be done about it? But how many times do you have to read a report one way and it's loud and proud and aggressive and this is how it is and this is what has to happen, and then you find something else and it's absolutely opposite? And I'm stuck because I'm not there. I have to try to decide, well, is this report the truth or is this report the truth? To risk politicizing a point, here's an example. It was about, it was at the beginning of the summer, so it'd be the winter time for the southern pole, and I happened to see an article that cruise liners stranded in the ice. I like boats and stuff, and so it caught my eye. Ooh, that's a bummer to be on a cruise and get stuck in the ice. But then I was thinking, who in their right mind goes on a cruise with a bunch of ice? Don't you go to the Bahamas or Hawaii or something sort of interesting? And so I thought, And so I'm reading along, and then I read that article, and you know how it is. There's a link and a link and a link. And so I start trying to find, and then I find out that, it really wasn't a cruise ship. It was a commercial ship, and the passengers had been rescued by helicopter, but the crewmen had stayed on, and they had gotten trapped. Oh, okay. What kind of commercial ship was it? So I read some more, and I finally find out that it was a scientific research vessel that was sent to study the effects of global warming, but it got caught in excessive ice way before they ever expected it. Yeah, just let that soak for a second. And here's my thing. Why didn't they just say that? Why didn't they just say, research vessel studying global warming got caught in an unusually thick and early field of ice? That's the facts. Then we could say, well, now, does that mean this, or is this, or give me some more facts. Just tell me what happened. Then maybe we can figure out what it means. But that's not how it goes today. And both sides will talk of any issue. We'll say, read this article and see how this person was destroyed, and how they're an idiot, and how they're a moron, and how blah, blah, blah. And there's this aggressive, ugly, destructive language. And then the other side will speak the same way. And it's about destroying your opponent. It's about winning. It's about making sure you know that they're useless or worthless. So I have two questions. How do we ever have any kind of lasting, authentic relationship that has room for disagreement? Is anybody married here today? Just one of us, yeah. Does anybody have disagreements? So how do you do that? How do you disagree? How do you even disagree passionately? I mean, how do you even really disagree and still have a relationship and not get unfriended? How do we do that? I think we're losing the ability to do that. We don't know how to do that. But then number two, what is truth? Well, if you're wrong about global warming or about other kinds of issues, well, I mean, that's not good and there are consequences. But what happens if you're wrong about life? Because you only get to do it once. And even more importantly, what happens if you're wrong about eternal life? You only get to do that once. Man, I don't want to go through life going, well, I don't know. I mean, there's this. Where John says, here's what you need to know. God is light. There's no shadow. There's no gray area. There's no dim spot. There's no maybes. that God's truth, God's holiness, God's love, who God is, doesn't change, doesn't shift. It's always the same. We've got to have a good compass to get where we're wanting to go. And if that's in question, how do we ever get out of the woods? So the central concept that John says is, what you need to know is that God is light, and there's no shadow in God. You don't have to have question, you don't have to have doubt, but you can have assurance. There's a glare on the light. Do I get to go to... Oh, perfect. Okay, let's look at the first verses of the chapter. So here's how John starts this book. He says, what was from the beginning, what we have heard, what we have seen with our eyes, and what we have looked at and touched with our hands concerning the word of life. And the life was manifested, and we have seen and testified and proclaimed to you the eternal life, which was with the Father and was manifested to us. What we have seen and heard, we proclaim to you also. How many times is John going to say the same thing? Are you hearing it? Did you hear that? He said it 3 times. He says, this thing I'm telling you about, I was there. Seen it. I've experienced it. Let's see now. Here's a pop quiz. Does anybody remember life before the internet? Anybody? Yeah? I saw a picture the other day of an Encyclopedia Britannica set, and the caption was, this was my Google. One of my friends calls it praying to Saint Google when you don't know something. I remember when we first got internet and the noise your computer made when it would dial up, right? And I remember when pictures loaded one line at a time. I mean, you can almost hear the typewriter, as your pictures would. Well, they first started to try to have online commerce, and people early on said, nobody's going to buy stuff online. That's just dumb, right? And the reason why nobody will buy something that they can't try on, they can't test, they can't feel with their hand, they're not going to buy it. And that was a real issue early on. Online commerce really stuttered because, well, how do you're going to buy a shirt? How do you know if it really fits? Because you've got a picture, but you know how it is. Things are not always as they appear in the picture. So what if you don't like the color? What if it doesn't fit right? Or what if it doesn't really work? And so something came into being that you and I have gotten so used to now. When you go to Amazon.com or wherever it is that you buy your stuff, they're going to have a picture of the product. But here's an issue. When you look at the picture, there are a couple of factors you're looking for. There's a picture, but now with Amazon.com or whatever, there's 5,700 versions of that thing, whatever you're trying to buy. So you're going to buy a switch, you're going to buy a light bulb, you're going to buy a shirt. Well, here are all these choices. Of course, you're looking at price, but most of us have bought something super cheap online once. And so we've also been taught, just because it's the cheapest, that may not be what I want. So now I've looked at the price, and then right underneath that is the manufacturer description. Is that right? And you click on it and it expands, and it tells you, this is the greatest thing ever. You buy this, you'll never have trouble, it'll change your life, right? Nobody ever says, now if you buy our product, we'll ship it to you, and it'll probably work, and it usually does, but every once in a while we have trouble with it, but I hope it works out for you. Now that would be honest, right? I mean, I don't know anything that's not like that. So when you and I look at that, there's a picture, there's a price, there's a manufacturer description. What do we normally scroll to and look for? Customer reviews. We're looking at the star rating. I understand from what I've heard that the online commerce people will fight like tigers for those star ratings because that's where they live or die. Because if you're looking at Amazon.com and one product has a 1.5 stars and one has 4.5, which one are you going to buy? So what's happened to fill in the gap, because I can't touch it. I can't go to the store and try it on and walk around the store and go, yeah, that's pretty comfortable. So what am I going to have to do? I'm looking for a customer review. I want to hear from real people like me, and I want to know, does it work? I know the claim, sure. Every manufacturer is going to claim it's the answer, or they wouldn't be offering it for sale. I know that. I scroll right past it. I don't even read it. I might look at a technical discussion depending on like the size or the weight or something. I don't even look at what the manufacturer says. I go right to customer reviews, best review, worst review, and I'm trying to make a decision right there. Why am I doing that? I need to know from a real person if what I haven't seen yet really works. Did you hear what John just said? Because today the question is exactly the same. The church is saying if you will follow Christ, he will change your life. Everybody says that. Coast Soap says that. If you buy their product, it will change your life. So what people are asking today is it real? And how are they going to figure it out? Because you're talking about a God that I can't see. You're talking about a Jesus I can't put my hand on. So how do I know how this is really going to work? What's the question? I need customer reviews. That's the modern term for testimony or witness or sharing your story or your example or your own experience. Would you give Jesus a 5-star rating or a 2-star rating? That's what people are asking. Let's read it again. Listen to what he says. What was from the beginning, what we have heard and what we have seen with our eyes, what we have looked at and touched with our hands concerning the word of life. And the life was shown or manifested or demonstrated. And we have seen and we testify and we proclaim to you the eternal life. That's a life you can't see. You can't know it yet. It's in the future. They said, yeah, but we can tell you about it. Which is in the Father was manifested to us. What we have seen and heard, we proclaim to you also. What 1 John is an inspired customer review to a people who are living in a society that's going over the edge. The clouds of persecution and suffering are already building on the horizon. It's already out of vogue and unpopular to follow Christ. That's already been true. But it's really going to hurt in the future. So, is this worth it? I can't help but mention it. I can't help but think about it. It was just a few days ago that somebody asked the question, are you a Christian? That's what I understand. Now, there's all sorts of reports out there, so take that as far as I can tell, because I've spent a lot of time trying to run that one down. Is that really what happened? It frustrates me. You have to look for that. But there were some kids apparently asked, are you a Christian? Good, because you're going to see God soon. And that was it. So, is it worth it? Well, we're going to spend from now till Wednesday night with John sitting at his feet as an aged Christian and a beautiful spiritual grandfather says to us, my little children, it's the best thing that will happen to you. I used to be called a son of thunder. And you know what my favorite part is? The Gospels present two important truths at the same time. They present John as a son of thunder, and we got a couple of snapshots that show you what that means. And you know what the Gospels also call John? The disciple whom Jesus loved. The son of thunder, the loud mouth, the one that said, we go down fire from heaven, that one? Yeah, that one. Jesus loved him, but he was. Those two things were both true at the same time. And I don't know about you, that gives me hope. Whew, okay, maybe this is going to be all right. There's three things that John's going to say. We'll get into that in the message, but I appreciate your attention. We'll put a bookmark in it here, and we'll come back to 1 John. Thank you very much.